evening, everyone. Let's start making your way to your seats. This might be an opportune moment to go get a refill on popcorn and or grab a cold beverage. You're welcome to do that. Please make yourself at home this evening. Don't hesitate to get up and recharge for a refill. We'll start up in another minute or so. It's such a pleasure to see all of you. Welcome. Kind of quickly. We're ready to start this thing. Let's just get ready. This is always the dilemma, right? We have a view worth looking at and cover it up. Excellent. We can get started here, everyone. Welcome. We have such a special evening program here this evening. This is the first ever combined State of the Yampa and Yampa Basin Rendezvous keynote event. And so this special State of the Yampa here this evening brings not only a keynote and the 2023 State of the Yampa. Round of applause for this year of the Yampa. We also have a special film this evening. So there's a couple of transitions in the program. I'll introduce those here in a moment and say a few words of welcome to kick us off. And then we'll jump right in here to the evening event. My name is Nathan Stewart. I'm faculty here at Colorado Mountain College. I serve on the steering committee of the Yampa Basin Rendezvous, which is in its 6th year this year. A quick look at where we're going to go this evening. Really exciting agenda. So I'll kick off, this is not as exciting, but I do want to capture some of the really important points from today's meeting, the Yampa Basin Rendezvous. Yes, it's exciting. So I'll start with a couple of those. And then we're going to move into our State of the Yampa. I'll have the privilege of introducing a dear friend and colleague, Ken Bertries, in a couple of moments here to help us make that transition. We'll welcome in our keynote speaker for the evening. We have such a great honor to welcome our author journalist here this evening, guys. We have Q&A time set aside. This is something we hope you'll capitalize on here with us. Those lights can come up. We'll turn this room from a presentation room into an open dialogue. So please be thinking of your questions as the evening goes on. We have a little break in the middle, which brings it in off the beaten path, a chance for a book signing, recharge, refresh, right? Move time. So great agenda here this evening. I want to start before capturing some of the highlights from today with this. How many here in the audience love floating the Yampa? Okay. How many of you are passionate stewards of Yampa River health? Yes! How many of you would love to learn basic field skills in river monitoring? Keep those hands up. We are going to fill this class tonight. Can I get a runner? Let me see those hands up. Can I get a runner? Yes. Okay. So here's the keep on. Yes, we can. So here's the deal. The timing might have thrown us off here. We suspected this would immediately fill and waitlist, and that's it. And it hasn't. We have, Luke, one or two? One student enrolled in this course. Here's our key information. This can't stand at one student. We have a remarkable pair of faculty. So many of you know Sarah Rathburn, Colorado State University, hydrologist. This would be among those most renowned in hydrology, period. Teaching alongside a favorite faculty at Colorado Mountain College that many of you know in pursuit of his PhD as we speak, with chemists. It doesn't get better than this, right? And that class is an applied field class. If we can get 5 of you, that's one vote. Luke, am I right? If we get 5 more, that's a second raft. How many rafts do we get?
You can't have more than 8.
No more than 8 rafts. You do math. Okay. See, you can tell by the passion in our voices here that we need to get that number to get this class to fly. Let's get this class to fly. So take a moment, pull out your phones, get that phone photo, raise your hand here for a flyer, and let's build this class. Thank you, everyone. Luke, any additional words you might say before we move on? Enroll.
Yeah, enroll.
Enroll.
You don't have to be a CNC student.
You don't.
You can email your person high school aid. You can also.
This is great. Can we speak to that question?
Yeah, 3 credits, so. District over us.
In-district prices are very reasonable. I can't tell you an amount, but they're very reasonable.
Couple hundred? Yeah. Couple hundred or so. Yep. And I think this is on our shoulders. This really could have been launched as a community class, and we probably would have gotten many more of you right out of the gate. So we'll do that next summer. You'll see that look that way to attract more of you.
It is titled Special Topics. So, Special Topics, that's good. 27.5.
That's great. It is a special topic. Okay, great. Just really briefly here, I'm going to give us a quick sort of retrospective, prospective, just really with the intention of hooking those of you who may join us tomorrow. If you know a little bit more about what we're going to take on day 2, the Basin Rendezvous. So a quick credit, this is such a lovely image. Many of you know Jeff Hall well in our community. This is one of his photographs. It's used in our media throughout this conference event, and we really want to credit Jeff for that remarkable shot of the sleeping giant this time of year, right? That feels like home right now. We had some wonderful opening remarks from Congressman Jody Goose. This was a video, and we had that posted, so we'll guide you to that. If you weren't able to join us here in the room today, that connection to Representative Goose's priorities is a powerful one for us. Our first panel focused on low to no snow future. This will probably make you squirm in your seat, and rightfully so. We looked at data important to our understanding of change, and thought a lot about how we can measure, monitor that change, and what it means to our industry and economy, livelihood, and identity. We're delighted that Kent here this evening again with us. Our second panel focused on adaptation, implementation, and capacity. And that brought a talented group here in front of us, including our own Melanie Kilpatrick. And if you haven't worked with or met Melanie, boy, is she a remarkable asset in northwestern Colorado. It was great to hear her at work and speak to the project she's engaged in and leading for us in our region. We went this afternoon to the Fish Creek Water Treatment Plant. Many of you recognize that view on the left, but may not recognize that view on the right. Some of you do. Awesome. Did you go with your school program? Awesome, that's great. We'd love you to work there. we need talent there. We have talent there. We had a great panel here that involved Michael Woodbridge, Tyler Gilman, Julie Baxter, Carolina Enriquez. Many of you know this group. In fact, it was John Twitchell, not Carolina Enriquez, on the far left there, who contributed. A little look at what's happening tomorrow. Please come and join us for our panels. We have panel first opening of the day here, focusing on preserving communities and culture through water resiliency. Yampa Basin Rendezvous, in its 6th year now, has not taken on a panel that looks like this. We're incredibly excited to, and we need to, right, for the benefit of our water resiliency. Opening panel tomorrow morning, right here. It starts at 9. Our second panel of the day features our keynote speaker this evening, and 2 colleagues here who will be bringing some of their expertise and experience, lessons learned from their work in their own basins, to ours here, focusing on slow water solutions. Second part of the morning, please be here with us for that panel. Tomorrow afternoon, Friday, after that lunch hour, we're going to head out to Elkhead Creek Ranch. Many of you know the O'Neills really well, and this is our chance to go visit them and speak with some of their partners, look at restoration efforts they are doing, low tech and higher tech. Right? Good look at that spectrum on the ground. So come join us for that trip. It'll be a memorable, certainly. A quick thank you here. Our steering committee's in the room. We don't all get to thank them all the time. It's really important work to put together something like this. I start with these logos to give you a sense of how diverse the group is. It's Western, not just our basin. And these are those folks that maybe we can get a little round of applause of. Excellent. So a final plug here. Make this a part of your day tomorrow, Friday. Some really special voices in the valley here with us. Final note, if you're enjoying this, don't be shy. Thank you for our evening food and refreshments. So a special thank you to friends in Yampa, Mountain Top, Storm Peak, and Drunken Onion. Don't let this food sit or beverages sit, right? Don't leave them here with us tonight. Excellent. I'm going to make a transition here and welcome our first voice to the stage. It is my great privilege to introduce Kent Bertries, dear friend and colleague. Kent Bertries currently works with the Friends of the Yampa, FOTY, as the Recreation and Education Coordinator. He's been a longtime board member and active volunteer with FOTY since the late 1990s. As the acting recreational representative to the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable, Kent has participated in many local, regional, and statewide planning efforts. He is an adjunct professor at CMC's Alpine campus, teaching river and canyon orientation courses. Many of you know him from your courses in the field with him. His real job is managing owner and master of chaos, we love this title, Kent, at Steamboat Hydrocats, Northwest Colorado's only snowcat skiing operation. In his spare time, Kent is focused on raising his 2 daughters with his wife Jules. All 3 of those women are remarkable. And celebrating most everything that is Northwest Colorado. Kent, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to share this State of the Yampa address with Lindsay Marlowe, the Executive Director of the Friends of the Yampa, who will come up in a second to talk, so you can go all to finish this off. But first off, thank you so much for coming. This is outstanding, great to see you all. It's a cool partnership that we have with the Yampa Basin Rendezvous and all of our friends at Colorado Mountain College and beyond. So really appreciate you coming here. Thank you all for being dedicated to the Yampa River. You know, if you weren't here, we wouldn't have you as friends. So appreciate you being friends of ours. Of course, you too can be a friend of the Yampa by becoming a member. You can give us a lot of money because we have a lot of cool things going on. So fundraising support is always nice. And then just loving this river that we have and respecting it and keeping it as wild as possible. So thanks. So I'm going to tonight just talk about a little bit about where the river is today. You know, I'm going to give you a snapshot of flows and what's happening with the river. But then we're going to discuss what we've been doing and what Friends of the Yampa is going to do, as well as how you can get involved with Friends of the Yampa. First off, let's get a little geeky. Okay, let's look at some river flows and snow totals. So if you've never seen this website, this is a good one to kind of highlight in your future review. This is the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. There's all these dots on the map, and those are the different stream flow gauges that we have in Colorado. The Stream Flow Center pulls real-time stream flow, and then they forecast what the stream flow is going to be in the short-term future. And we can zoom into the Steamboat 5th Street Bridge, which I use on a daily basis. And we can see here that the river is currently flowing at about 2490 CFS at the gauge. And then we can also look into the future. You know, it's looking like 10 days forecast is what they do. And they use modeling techniques, they use ground truthing from years in the past, and then they source it with their humans, and they identify where flows should be. One thing to note, you know, we're looking at our Yampa River Festival this coming Saturday, and if you've ever floated the Yampa River through town, the Iron Horse Bridge will cut your head off with a certain flow, because the bridge was built in 1910 or somewhere around there. thinking about us boaters and floaters at that time. So we've been identifying it, and we're thinking we're good. Just don't take an oar boat if you're doing the raft race with us on the side. 2,700 is pretty big, but at 2,700 you can get down on a paddle boat, ducking your head, getting low. So we look at this, you know, to see where the forecast is going. And it's a great tool for us to see where we're at today, here in Steamboat at least. And shameless plug, Yampa Festival this weekend, come on out. We have events starting tonight. This is our kickoff, the State of the Yampa. We've done this address for many, many years. Lots of times it was at the old Chief Theater, many of you have probably, hopefully been to in the past. And a similar event, so it's great to rekindle it this year. It's been a few years we've taken off due to COVID and other things. The event itself, we have a kayak race tomorrow night on Fish Creek. We'll see some athletes going down the flooding Fish Creek, Upper Fish Creek by the water and sanitation, or the water treatment facility. And then the main event is on Saturday at really around 1 o'clock. If you want to see some action, come down at that time. And you'll see vendors, you'll have a nice community of people there celebrating the river. This is an image from last year, and believe it or not, we have very similar flows in the river to last year. Last year was a nice, slower runoff. We have around that 2,000 CFS. Obviously 2,700 is a little bigger, but very similar. You know, looking at weather, I'm sure you all are seeing it, it's coming in. We expect the river to drop just because it's going to get into the 60s over the next couple days. And Saturday is looking like rain potentially, which is an amazing thing, but it may impact our river festival a little bit, so bring a rain jacket. Still come out. It's like the first year in probably a decade that we've had River Fest with potential rain. So this is another site we use looking directly at the stream gauges. This doesn't utilize the forecasts. As a boater, I use this every day, check out flows. Here's the Yampa River at Steamboat Springs. Seeing that it's stabilized, and we think the initial peak has happened. You see there around, what is it, May 26th, a peak that is now trailing downward. The forecast is looking like snow over the next 10 days. Granted, with a heat wave coming, if we get a heat wave, 80-degree temps or more, it can turn pretty quick. The river can spike again, but probably we've seen our peak on the Yampa. Looking at Deer Lodge Park, this is our lowest stream gauge on the river, where the river flows into Dinosaur National Monument. We see the river holding today at about 13,000 CFS. It peaked around 20,000, which was our highest peak since 2011, which the river was at about 28,000 cubic feet per second. That was the highest since 1982. The river was big. That's about 150 miles downstream from us here. And then here's an interesting one. So this is above Stagecoach Reservoir. So today the river is flowing 79 CFS into the reservoir. And what do we say it's here in Steamboat, 2,700? So I look at this and I think, okay, we talk about the Yampa River having a wild hydrograph, a natural hydrograph. Some people call it free flowing. And I've had many people be like, yeah, the river's not free flowing. There's a reservoir midstream, you know, there's a reservoir right there blocking the flow. Well, at its peak, Stagecoach flowed at 330 CFS this year. And that was right around that 20,000 CFS downstream. So honestly, we can call the Yampa free flowing. Now, let's think about this. Is any river truly free flowing anymore? You know, even the most free flowing river out there has an ag diversion. Somebody's pulling water out of it for municipality or some sort of the other. But here, you know, I think we can honestly be proud to say and be truthful about the fact that the Yampa has some free flowing entries, because the reservoir, upstream of that reservoir, there's not much water going down that reservoir ever. Anyway, okay, another one we use. Snowpack. So snow water equivalent today, we're sitting right at about 100% snowpack for today over the last 10 years. This shows you on the black line, that's where we were at. Pretty great snowpack, amazing snowpack. If you were here this morning, you heard about me talking about this year being maybe the best season ever since whatever, 2011 maybe. But we had a great snowpack, and it's definitely dropped over the past month just because of the lack of snow that we've had. We've had mild temps, but without that adding snowpack to some extent, we've seen it go down, but we're sitting good at snow. We should have a great summer. Let's just hope these mild temps and weather prolongs. What we've been doing here at Friends of the Yampa the past couple weeks, this is our annual crew that we take on our eco flight. It's part of our Yampa River Awareness project that we do. We combine a flight over the Yampa Basin to look at the landscapes of the river, and then the next day we float the Yampa through Yampa Canyon. And this was our crew we took down. We started here in Steamboat and looked at these peak flows in downtown Steamboat Springs. This is right by River Creek Park, just downstream. That beautiful section that just overflows its banks into high water. We then went down to the Elk River and saw this. It was flowing about 5,000 CFS on that day. At the confluence of the Elk and the Yampa, the Elk actually produces more water than the Yampa does. Yeah. But it has a third of the watershed. So an interesting stat, if there's a scientist out there that wants to do something, kind of look at this, because it may be the most producing river for its size of watershed in the country. In the world. In the world. We need to definitely truth that. So some student, it's a project for you, please. But it's true, these mountains just produce so much snow, and it's evident in what we have with our wild Yampa River. Along the way, we went down to the Morgan Bottoms. This is just near Hayden. This is a unique habitat right there. The flooding occurs when the river has enough water. This habitat of cottonwood, red osier dogwood, and box elder is a unique habitat that used to be found all over the West, but as we've dammed, diverted, and dewatered our rivers to the point they don't flood the banks anymore, this habitat's gone away, so there's really cool species that still live in there, and our friends at the Nature Conservancy right there is right around the Carpenter Ranch. They've done a great job working to support these habitats. In Craig, we see the Yampa meandering and flooding its banks also. Craig is actually the upper limit of the critical habitat for the endangered fish. Around Hayden and Craig, specifically, the river gets warmer, it's no longer a cold water fishery. You do get some big trout down there. We start to see these endangered fish, and they actually come up all the way from the White River, migrate up and down this river. It's pretty cool what these fish do. But here's where our habitat is. There's 4 endangered fish on the Colorado, or on the Yampa and the Upper Colorado River system. And it's mainly because this river contributes so much water flow and sediment to the entire system. These fish can still find refuge here. Downstream of Craig, the river goes through the Little Yampa Canyon and then through some historical significant agricultural lands. Little Yampa Canyon is important. It's one of 3 sections of the Yampa that the BLM has found as suitable for wild and scenic river status. Show us a river that's more suitable than the Yampa. I don't know. It'll probably never become truly wild and scenic because of the political differences that some of us have in this state. But this canyon offers a great float. Who here's done the Little Yampa Canyon on a float? Yep, pretty cool place. It's 2 to 3 days. Great family float, great place, you don't have to get a permit. And Friends of Yampa worked in partnership with a veterans group, the BLM, City of Craig, years ago. We created some campsites down there that we get to enjoy. Below that, below Little Yampa Canyon is the Juniper Canyon. This is an area that with our partners at the Nature Conservancy and the Maybell Irrigation District are working on one of the largest projects we may ever do on the Yampa. The old Maybell diversion is kind of dilapidated, and we're working on fixing that. It's going to help shore up the water rights and the use of the river for the Maybell Irrigation District. It's going to help flows or help the endangered fish move up that diversion, which right now blocks the river. Plus, it may open us up to more floatable section of the river for later in the season. And on this day, you can see smoke in the picture around that point in our flight from here to Echo Park. We started seeing smoke from a fire in Canada. It was here a couple weeks ago. The smoke was at least. There's the smoke up above, the confluence of the Little Snake coming in from the north and the Yampa coming in from the east. This is the confluence of two of the most important rivers in the entire Upper Colorado River system. The Yampa contributes a ton of water, the Little Snake contributes a ton of sediment, and this combined river downstream supplies a myriad of habitats and great environmental benefits to the entire lower Yampa, entire Green River, all the way down to Lake Powell. And then finally, where the Yampa finalizes its course here at Echo Park, the 250-mile-long Yampa River comes in with the green. If you've ever been there, this is our center of the universe here in Steamboat, or in the Yampa River Basin. And it's a beautiful place for many reasons. In the 1950s, this was ground zero of a battle over dams on the Colorado River. After years of lobbying and debating about this, the Echo Park Dam was defeated. And what you see there would have been gone. The top fifth of the canyon would have been remaining. All of Gates Lador, all of Yampa Canyon would have been inundated. And it's amazing that people helped us protect that river years ago and defeated that dam that preserved those canyons in Dinosaur National Monument. Some say this was the origination of the modern environmental movement, the defeat of that dam. So it's pretty cool to go down there and kind of relive that history. And carrying on that tradition, we at Friends of the Yampa host an annual Yampa River Awareness Project float down Yampa Canyon. This was right after that trip. This was just a week ago we got off the river. We carry on that tradition in honor of those folks who did it before us. We organize about 30 people every year. They come out, they tell their story. They're scientists, they're politicians, they're water resource managers, they're endangered fish specialists, they're presidents of colleges, and the press. So our idea is to document, inspire, and educate people, and get their different perspectives on the river. We gather along the way, tell stories, talk about different perspectives, learn from each other, educate each other about the importance of the Yampa, as well as the Upper Colorado River system and the Greater Colorado River in general. Here's some pictures of the float at the put in at Deer Lodge. We actually have water overflowing its banks. If you've ever been there, you probably camped right there, but the campground was closed because it was running around 20,000 cubic feet per second. That's the entrance to the Yampa Canyon. It's a 5-day float. We spent 4 nights on the river. As you go down, you just see these beautiful walls. There's more exposed rock layers than you will find in the Grand Canyon. This is the famous Weber sandstone. 230 million years ago, it was a Sahara-like terrain here in Northwest Colorado, and this is what we get to see from it now that it's showing. Beautiful campsites we camp along. Just a great place to go visit the river. This is again Echo Park with Steamboat Rock. You can't see it, but the Green River comes in from the right. The Yampa River is flowing in right there. And then the joined river is a hybrid river. It's a great science experiment there. We have a wild river, we have a highly managed river, and then we have a hybrid river. And our friends at the monument do great work at that location and all through the monument themselves. Here's Split Mountain Canyon. That's kind of the last day of the trip. And I'd love to introduce Lindsay Marlowe, the executive director of the Friends of Yampa, one of my best friends, and my boss.
No one's Kent's boss. for giving us a platform to talk about what Friends of the Yampa does. I started this job about 4 years ago, and I was the first full-time employee. And now we have a staff of about 7 in the process. So, and we're trying to expand our scope and where we make the greatest impact, including downriver and up into the tributaries. So, and what better way to do that than to capture the youth in this basin? And so, about 2 years ago, we started a youth river camp in partnership with CMC. And it hit. In fact, this year we offered 4 camps, and all 3 steamboat camps were sold out within the first 5 minutes of opening. So we are also trying to help the issue with summer programming, but can't address everything because we do have a wild river and our season's very limited. These are just a few highlights of programs we do. We do many, but the one I want to highlight is connected to that eco-health class that we partner with CMC to provide so that we can do the Yampa River Scorecard Project. The Yampa River Scorecard Project started about 2 years ago, in which we knew that we needed to measure the health of the river, and we needed to do it in a long-term fashion so that we can do a check back and see if river managers in this basin are in fact doing the right thing. And then also, how do we tell the story of the Yampa, its health, and get people to care? And how we did that was by measuring the ecosystem services, which ecosystem services, what I mean by that is how we benefit from the river, how the river provides for us, so recreation, agriculture, drinking water, etc. And so this past year, last year we went out in the field with this class that we have at CMC, and we did a lot of measuring. We floated the river over 39 miles from Hayden to Craig, and did a lot of measurements. We did a lot of the ecosystem health measurements, and did a lot of professional development, obviously. People that are interested in rivers, this is a great class for you, and kind of see what goes behind the scenes and when we assess rivers. What was super important also is there's a lot of jargon used in river science, in all sciences in general. But we wanted to make sure that we go one step further to tell the story and do storytelling that's engaging. And so that people get interested, because it has to start with the grading, and it has to start with understandable information. And so I highly recommend you guys go to yampascorecard.org and check out the Middle Yampa was just scored. So this was the results. The Middle Yampa got a B, which means it's relatively healthy. It just needs very little management to keep it a sustained and healthy river. Think of an A as like a very natural, almost untouched river that can sustain itself with very little, like it needs no management, no help. So that's relatively good. I mean, when we look at the Middle Yampa, we think of this river that floods its banks, that has very little development, and it's mostly ag-based. And so, all good news. If you're asking why agriculture is great, it's because we're still trying to figure out how to measure the value of the river to agriculture. And so if you guys have ideas, we're always looking to that, because that's that ecosystem service. And then the upper part of the pie is all the ecological health and function of the river, which also scored a B. And if you go to the website, you can click on every one of these attributes and find out not only what it means, how it was measured in a very succinct way, and then learn about some more related to the river. Another thing we're working on is Outstanding Waters in partnership with American Rivers and American Whitewater and other smaller watershed organizations. And Outstanding Waters is a designation of a tributary or a main stem of a river that says that its water quality is outstanding, but also it has some attribute, that recreational attribute or ecosystem attribute, that is valued in the system. And so we were asked by American Rivers to identify tributaries to the Yampa to protect. So by getting outstanding waters designation, it sort of classifies that tributary and hopefully prevents any degradation in the future. And so we got together and we picked 14 tributaries, and we showed up to the meeting and found out all the other groups picked 2. So we didn't realize exactly what we're getting into, and thanks to Jenny Fritzen, who has been leading the effort. And it's a bear of a project, but it's worthy. And every time we're out there snowmobiling to a tributary up in North Route, we are proud. It's hard, but we're proud. It's a 2-year process, and we hope to protect all 14 tributaries. And then I do want to plug this one more time if you're thinking about it while Kent was talking. And next, we just started a program with the City of Steamboat Springs, in which the Yampa River Ambassador Program. So that's a outreach program in which people go to the river and talk to people about the Yampa and ensure that we're educating people on how to respect it and how to keep it clean and how to recreate safely. And so we are looking for volunteers. That's a way you can get involved. Another way is joining the class. Another way is coming to the River Fest. And then we also have many other ad hoc needs to volunteer. And then, of course, we have partnerships. Yampa Valley Sustainability Council is always looking for people to join their climate group. And then lastly, Friends of the Yampa in September took over managing the Yampa River Fund. The Yampa River Fund was initiated by the TNC and in partnership with the City of Steamboat and the Colorado Water Trust to create a sustainable funding source for flow releases out of Stagecoach Reservoir for in-stream flow uses, so environmental flows. And eventually, over time, it created a group of people comprising over 20 reps from the entire basin, including Moffat County. And so far, we've been able to fund for 3 years, projects up to $200,000 a year. And I can't remember what the exact count is of how many projects, but we're close to the 15 to 20 range of projects funded by the Yampa River Fund. And the 3 pools that they fund are flow releases out of Stagecoach and Elkhead Reservoir. And then habitat, like projects that increase habitat or benefit habitat. And then lastly, multi-benefit projects that, for instance, like a diversion structure that considers fish or recreational passage, etc. So that's been going well, and we are proud to manage it. So I think that's it. And if you want to find out more, we do much more, but those are the programs that I think I'm most proud of. And so if you want to find out more, come to our website. So thanks for coming, guys.
Excellent. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Kent. The 2023 State of the Yampa. Can you say something like, the State of the Yampa is... I could have practiced that. Should we give a yell? Wild or strong? Wild? The State of the Yampa is... Wild! Excellent. Well, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome our evening keynote speaker this evening. She is Erica Guise, author of Water Always Wins. Erica Guise is an award-winning independent journalist who writes about water, climate change, plants, critters, and other for the Scientific American, the New York Times, Nature, The Atlantic, The Guardian, National Geographic, The Economist, The Washington Post, Biographic, Wired, and many more. Her stories hail from North America, especially California and British Columbia, and the wider world. We have the opportunity to travel virtually tonight. In a quest for commonalities that bind us and innovations that inspire, she has reported from many intriguing places. Iraq, Peru, Cambodia, India, Syria, Kenya, China, Qatar, Laos, the United Kingdom, Vietnam, France, and many indigenous nations and territories. Her book, Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge, is about what she calls slow water innovations, that are helping us adapt to the increasing floods and droughts brought by climate change. Growing up in San Francisco Bay Area, she spent childhood vacations camping and hiking in state and national parks, swimming in any body of water she came across. She remains an ardent fan of critters, plants, hydrology, wilderness, and hiking. Erica, it's such a pleasure to welcome you here.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me? Yeah. Getting over a cough, so hopefully I won't start coughing, but I have cough drops. So. Yeah, it's great to be here with friends of the Yampa. I love friends of rivers, obviously. Also, thank you so much to Jenny for all of your hard work getting me here, and the whole group. Yeah, Water Always Wins is really about the need for the dominant culture to change its relationship with water. In the dominant culture, by which I mean Europe, North America, exported around the world through colonialism, we really tend to think of water as either, a resource, a commodity, or a threat, depending on whether we have in our minds too little or too much. And the instinct then becomes to try to control it. But not all humans think that way. And in researching my book and traveling to these many places, I found people who are innovating various ways to work with water in many of the kind of the same ways that we've been hearing about in terms of really making space for water to be able to fulfill its systems and its progress through the land. This woman here is a marsh dweller, and she lives in the Mesopotamian marshes of Iraq. And the marshes there are thought to perhaps be the biblical Garden of Eden. And they have basically been continuing this culture for 9,000 years. They were first Neolithic fishers. 3,000 years later, they evolved into the Sumerian civilization. They have stayed on the marshes through all kinds of other civilizations that have risen and fallen near them. And as these other civilizations, many of them very famous, many of them irrigated agriculture civilizations, as they fell, the marshes then retook their land again. Right? And really, the way they did this is that they accept the wetlands, they accept the marshes for what they are. They do not try to drain them or fill them, but they instead live on top of them. They raise water buffalo for cheese and milk, they fish, they trade with people on land for vegetables, and they make great use of Phragmites australis, 20-foot tall reed that is a scourge elsewhere as an invasive species, but it is native to the Mesopotamian marshes. And this is Mudif, which is their community center. Their homes are also kind of the same shape, a little more modest, but really they recognize the bounty of the marshes and give them space to do what they do. And during the era of Saddam Hussein, some of the rebels against him were hiding out in the marshes, and so Saddam had a bunch of levees built to de-water them. And a lot of the marshmallows had to go to Babylon and Baghdad and live on land for the first time. But when Saddam fell, they went right back. They busted holes in levees. The water returned, and so did they. And you know, the longevity of this culture, 9,000 years, just pales in comparison to our own. And I can't help but think that respect for water has a lot to do with that. I'm not suggesting that we all should be living on top of marshes, but you know, there's a lot to be said for that shifting relationship. And I think, you know, as a journalist, I've been covering climate change for more than 20 years, and you know, finally people are acknowledging that it's happening and that humans are causing it. And then increasingly we're seeing people recognizing that climate change is water change. And you know, that's great that people understand the way that climate is increasing the severity of flood and drought. But one thing I think that's getting lost is that it's not just climate change that's causing these troubles with water. It's really also significantly our development choices. And that's urban sprawl, industrial agriculture, and the very kind of control-oriented, concrete way that we try to control water. And the scale of the impacts of our attempts to control water globally have been massive. Filled or drained up to 87% of the world's wetlands. Dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's big rivers. And then just since 1992, the land area covered by pavement in cities has doubled. So, you know, there's been a big increase in urban flooding. It's because the water can't sink into the land anymore. So there are many, many people around the world who have a different attitude toward water. Many of them are indigenous peoples from various places. But there are also a lot of people I can think of as water detectives. And these are environmental engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, urban planners, who are asking a question that's very different to one that we may be used to, which is, what does water want? And so many of our attempts to control water speed it up and move it off the land quickly. But what water wants really is a return of these many slow phases that we've eradicated with our development. So, you know, wetlands, mountain meadows, high altitude forests, floodplains. And there's so much more that we could be doing to make space for slow water throughout our human habitats. So, like slow food, slow water approaches are bespoke. They're unique to each place, and they seek to work with local geology, biology, and culture, rather than try to control it. Slow water is socially just, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'll just say, you know, I think people are very familiar with the idea of if you levee up a river, it raises the level because it doesn't have access to the floodplain, it can't slow down, it's going higher and faster. So, you know, if you have areas that can't afford a levee, then those areas are going to experience worse flooding impacts, so that's an environmental justice issue. But similarly, dams, there was a really interesting 40-year overview around the world that found that dams brought water to 20% of the world's population, but decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. So, you know, I grew up in California, the answer is always build a dam. But, you know, it's not magic water, it's coming not only from other ecosystems, but also from other people. Slow water projects are deploying systems theory rather than single-focused problem solving. And they're trying to respect water's relationships with rock and soil and underground and microbes and fish and beavers and people. Slow water projects are ideally local. I already alluded to some of the problems involved with bringing water from other basins. But there's also an importance in terms of learning the local water cycle and working within it. So, you know, people who receive water from big dams, they might seem like the lucky ones, but in fact, Socio-hydrologists have shown again and again that you bring in more water, you just increase demand. You have more agriculture, more businesses, more housing developments, because people are like, oh, look, there's more water. And then you have another cycle of scarcity. You're making more people vulnerable to a water cycle in places where you don't have enough water to support them. I told Jenny I was working today, and this was part of my work, walking out to see the river park and some of the area just upstream of this town. And I think it's so beautiful out there. It's so great to see the water running high. And I was reading in the local newspaper that human development has not been flooding. And I can't help but think that this is a significant reason why. Because you've given the water space, you've given the water places to be on land, so that you haven't built right in the floodplain, at least not in this area. But often upstream is an important place to look. Like in really built-up cities, people think like, oh, we can't possibly make space for water, everything's built. But it's an entire watershed. And if you can slow the water as it's coming downstream, that helps too. It helps decrease the flood stage. I think of Pamplona, Spain, that was flooding a lot, and there was some marginal ag land upstream of the city, and they returned that to the floodplain, and now they don't have flooding problems anymore. So another fun thing I saw today was this. So it seems like our furry friends are also hard at work in the area, and so I will talk about them next. I suspect this crowd is very familiar with the story of how beavers were largely eradicated from North America and Europe. The continent used to be much, much wetter, much boggier. It's thought that perhaps 10% of North America was beaver-created wetlands. And so obviously this has huge impacts for habitat for other species that rely on beavers, but it also has really big impacts for groundwater and for the surface-groundwater connection because they're linked, and beavers played a really big role in helping that water flow and recharge underground. So the West that we've come to know is significantly drier than it was historically. It's not just that we're taking all the water out of the rivers, it's also because we have eliminated this critter who does such a great job of slowing water on the land. So this particular beaver I met on the Tulalip Tribe's reservation in Washington State. There have been different eras of people rediscovering beavers and appreciating everything that they do for stream health. You may be familiar with the period in the mid-20th century, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the modern kind of love affair with beavers dates to the 90s in Washington State. And the Tulalip tribe, because they are sovereign government and have the right to do what they want on their land, were one of the first places for beaver releases. And so they are catching beavers that are coming into conflict with people in suburban areas often, and then usually relocating them to more rural places, headwater streams. But first they go to the Tulalip tribes to be reunited with their family group and for the scientists to do some measurements. But the beaver is also making a comeback in the United Kingdom, which is an interesting story because they have been completely extirpated there for 400 years. And they remain in some places in Europe, like Bavaria, and I think around Croatia and places like that. But they weren't in the British Isles. And there are a lot of really old towns right near streams and rivers, and as climate change is bringing bigger rainstorms, they're having more and more flooding of these towns. In Germany too, we saw some news stories a couple years ago when there was massive flooding there. And you can see like people have built right up to the stream. So the beavers that are being reintroduced in the UK, and it started out with a little bit of, you've heard of guerrilla gardening? So this is guerrilla beavering. People secretly released beavers where they thought they might be able to do some good. And so then the Environment Agency decided they could stay while they were studied, and now they've passed the test and they're being redeployed more broadly. But the scientists studying them have found that the places with beaver dams reduce peak flows by 30%, even during really saturated winter conditions. And they also, continue to supply water during dry seasons. It sounds weird to think about droughts in England, but they do have them. Water continues to flow out of dams even when it stops flowing into them. And that's because of the groundwater recharge that they've achieved. So this poster is from California from the mid-20th century. They did actually parachute beavers back into areas where there weren't many roads. Idaho did this as well. Idaho made them in like little boxes that would sort of deconstruct upon landing. And so I always thought that this picture was kind of like artistic license, but I've been writing a story about beavers in California because there's now a statewide program to bring back the beaver in California with 5 state-level employees, full-time employees. And in fact, California did use these little burlap pouches for the beavers. But I think it's just really interesting because it shows that, in the 1920s and 1950s, people understood that, it says, these beavers, where does it say? Yeah, basically that they're going to be doing great things for watersheds. So in the West, their ability to store water and to help heal the surface-groundwater relationship is very important. Particularly with climate change as snowpack is melting, which has been a big water storage device. Beavers can help to store water on land. And a scientist in Washington who was doing some beaver relocations, he was monitoring them for a year afterward, and he found that in the first year, the beaver ponds stored 75 times more water above and below ground than areas without. And he did some calculations in terms of, what percentage X number of beavers would be for like Seattle's water supply. And just in one basin, it was like a quarter of the water that Seattle needed for a year. So that's one way that beavers returning can really help us in the West, help to create that wetter landscape again. However, researchers estimate that beavers are probably only at about 10% of their historic numbers, so there's still a long way to go. And then beavers have been getting some attention as potential help for fire. Obviously, water doesn't burn, and so their ponds are fire breaks. But because they're also raising the groundwater table across a wider area, the plants have access to that water, and they're not desiccated, and so therefore that also helps to extend the fire break. And ideally, beavers, if left to their own devices, as they have kits and they spread out, there's going to be a bunch of dams all down the river. So it could be a significant corridor for a fire break. All right, moving on to southern Arizona. This is another story that I'm working on, which hasn't been published yet. But I think some of you may be familiar with the main researcher here. Her name is Laura Norman, and she's a physical scientist with the USGS out of Tucson. And she's been studying for more than 15 years what she calls natural infrastructure for dryland streams. So in large parts of the West, but especially in southern Arizona, I think the land was treated quite badly by settlers, and so first they cut a lot of the trees and kind of denuded the landscape in that way, and then there were really, really high numbers of cattle grazing, like 10 times which also really denuded the land. And so then the water was racing off and causing really bad erosion. And so you have so many streams there that are just really, really cut down into the earth, and the water just runs off of it all so quickly. And so it turns out that for thousands of years, indigenous peoples in the Southwest and also in northern Mexico have been creating these natural infrastructure for dryland streams. They have been slowing water, and there's a lot of different styles and names, leaky weirs, rock dams, troncheras, check dams, log dams, and despite them, many of them having the word dam, Laura Norman strongly emphasizes they are not retaining water, they are not taking water from someone else, they are detaining water, they are just slowing it down. And so even in places where water managers are nervous about this potential holding on to water, everybody recognizes the need to deal with erosion. And so that is one way in terms of getting people open to this. And what Laura Norman has shown through her large body of work is that these projects are actually creating wetlands and drylands. In some cases, they're creating wetlands where they once were and were removed, and in other places, they are creating wetlands in places along the flow where they have opportunities to do so. And there's definitely a sense of, like in the dominant culture, when we think of water scarcity, when we think in dry places growing up in California, you know, there's this real scarcity mindset. People are really focused on grabbing every molecule and accounting for it, making sure it's all there. But what these projects show is, in fact, there's really an abundance benefit. Like when you take care of water systems, they're healthier, they're stronger, and they provide for us as well. And Laura Norman has quantified that. So there was this great kind of natural study that happened in the Chiricahua Mountains in southern Arizona on a place called El Coronado Cattle Ranch. And these landowners, Valor Clark and Josiah Austin, moved there from the east in the 1980s. And their land they experienced was, as I described it, the water would just roar across it when it rained, massive erosion. And in one place, the erosion was impacting a road, and so they just kind of instinctively built a little rock dam to try to retain some of that sediment, not really realizing that they were recreating something that people have been doing in this area for a very long time. And not too long after that, some people came from Mexico and asked if there was any work, and they were like, well, we could use more of these dams. And the people from Mexico were like, oh, yeah, we already know how to do this. We do this all the time. And so over a couple of decades, they built 20,000 of them, all throughout the headland tributaries of this watershed called Turkey 10. And Laura Norman heard about this, and she thought, wow, that would be a really interesting to study. And there was another stream right nearby called Rock Creek that had nothing done to it. It was just in this very degraded state. Now, as Valor and Josiah were doing this, downstream landowners were getting upset, thinking that they were holding on to their water. And so, yeah, this is just a little map of the two watersheds. She did a paired watershed study, comparing one to the other, and she studied many different aspects of it. But the finding that really was so amazing to me was that they weren't just slowing flash floods and extending the water supply into the dry season. They actually were making the stream produce 28% more water. And it's because the water that was just rushing down through the Rock Creek, it's running over rock, it's evaporating almost instantly. And so by holding the water in these wetland sponges that they created and helping it move underground where it can continue to supply the stream, they are creating more water. So I think it's an amazing example of this scarcity versus abundance kind of mindset that really runs counter to the way that in our culture we've come to think about water. All right, moving on to urban areas. This example is from Seattle, but all over the world, people moved near creeks and rivers and then dumped a bunch of sewage and trash in them, and then thought, this is an eyesore, we should fill it in and cover it up, put it in a pipe or bury it. A not uncommon statistic is that maybe 75% of streams and waterways in cities are buried underground. Every city has waterways underground. In places where waterways remain on the surface in cities, they often look like this. Straight, armored, cut way, way down below the surface. So ecologists call this urban stream syndrome. And it's marked by flash floods, right? The water is rushing off the pavement and dumping into the stream all at once. Unstable banks, it's basically creating a fire hose that erodes the banks. And tons and tons of pollution, like brake pad dust and lawn fertilizer, everything that's running off the pavement. And not very much life. What can live in there? So, this also followed kind of a typical settler development pattern. Most streams have riparian zones. People cut the trees. The water started running off faster. They thought, uh-oh, let's straighten this so the water won't flood. It'll just rush away faster. That caused more erosion. Then they thought, uh-oh, so they armored it. And so this is kind of a common phenomenon. And in Seattle, there's a 15-mile-long creek that runs through a watershed that's home to 70,000 people. It's called Thornton Creek. And it was regularly flooding a road, homes, a high school. And so the city wanted to do something about that. And because they have endangered salmon in the area, whenever they have to do a creek project, they have to try to do something for the salmon as well. Urban stream restoration these days often is kind of putting back the S-curves, removing the armoring, maybe planting some native plants, maybe dropping in some rocks and wood, make it look sort of habitat-y. People were finding that these restored urban streams needed a lot of ongoing maintenance. They weren't maintaining themselves. And the life that came back wasn't very diverse. It was sort of a crows and cockroaches situation. And so there was a 2019 paper in River Research and Applications where the author said river management based solely on physical science has proven to be unsustainable and unsuccessful because it's not solving flooding, it's not solving water scarcity or channel instability. And they said that really restoration is needed to use the power of biology to influence river processes. So a city biologist named Catherine Lynch thought, you know what, it's not just the river we see, it's also the river we don't see. And many of you may know about the hyporheic zone, right, which is not the groundwater, not the surface water, it's an ecotone in between. Water can move down through it and up through it, but it's also flowing downstream, although much more slowly than what's on the surface because it's moving through sand and rock. And these systems extend into the floodplain. On a large river, they can extend a mile from the bank. Smaller streams, perhaps 30 feet. And there's so much life in the hyporheic zone, microbes, crustaceans, worms, aquatic insects, and they play a really crucial role in nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon cycles. So this is very much like the stream's gut microbiome. And so if it's not very diverse, then the stream has not very much chance of being healthy. And particularly in an urban area where you've had all of that down cutting over many years, that soft material on the bottom of the stream bed is where the hyporheic zone exists. So sure enough, they did a study and they found out that basically it was down to granite. There was almost no, or bedrock, there was almost no material left for the hyporheic zone to exist in. And that's also incidentally where salmon lay their eggs. So if it's not there, they're gonna have trouble. So they decided, Catherine decided that they should try to recreate this missing hyperreach zone. And this, as far as I know, has not been done in an urban stream anywhere else in the world before this, which was like 2014, 2015. And so, they bought out houses over a period of 20 or 30 years from willing sellers. The houses were literally hanging over this Armored Creek, put it back in the curves, and then they rebuilt the hyperreach zone. They did a ton of modeling and even some physical testing, and trying to find the right gravel and sediment size, positioning the wood, trying to help the water move down into the hyperreach zone. And the project was just 2 sites, just 1,600 feet of stream in a 15-mile-long river. But it's had an outsized impact because, they started with the historical ecology, which is like, what did the water do before we changed it? Where is the water likely to go? And the reason that these areas kept flooding is because they were, shocker, historical floodplains. And so that's where they did these projects. And that's why these really kind of small areas have had an outsized impact. The project overall cost about $11 million, but the hyperreach component was only $300,000. But still, the budget, the bean counters wanted to cut it because they had no idea what it was. So there was an educational component for her. And the other thing that she did is she got them to agree to it by working with scientists from local universities to study different aspects of the project so that, going forward, other people who were doing similar projects could figure out, what had worked and what hadn't worked. So there was a physical analysis, like seeing was water actually moving down into the hyperreach zone, how long was it spending under there. They found that it was moving into the hyperreach zone 89 times more than before the project, which, given that there was almost no hyperreach zone before, that makes sense. And then there was a biological element. So the restorationists have kind of had this field of dreams approach, if we build it, they will come. But one reason they weren't coming, as one researcher told me, when your headwaters is a Home Depot parking lot, they don't really have anywhere to come from. And so in another, as far as I know, first in the world effort, they inoculated the stream with mini critters from a wilder stream nearby. They collected them in this little tube and then put the tube down in the hyperreach zone and allowed them to disperse. And, not everybody made it, but they did find 7 times more biodiversity in the restored sections and much, much greater species diversity. And then lastly, they did a chemical study. So first, they measured all of the pollutants that were running off into the stream from the urban environment, and they found 1,900, which is pretty typical. And, none of those are regulated. It's all non-point source pollution. And then they measured, okay, if a packet of water spends time in 7 feet of the hyperreach zone or 15 feet of the hyperreach zone, does that help? And they found that traveling 3 hours down 15 feet of the hyperreach zone reduced 78% of the chemicals by at least half. So, that's just like sticking to biofilms, that's not even being broken down yet, and it's such a small section. So I bring up this story just to think in terms of systems, right? These systems are so much more complicated than they appear, and it's really easy to destroy them and difficult to try to recreate them. But it's important to think about what water is doing on all these different levels, because it's all part of what makes it work and what makes it maintain itself. So since they did this project, the area hasn't flooded, and salmon actually came back to spawn in the hyperreach zone that they recreated. Another impact was, cities have to dredge their creeks really frequently because of all that superfine runoff dust, and when you have a healthier system that's redistributing its own sediment to a larger degree, you don't have to dredge as often. So they were dredging this area once a year at a cost of about $1 million each year. And now they do it every 3 to 5 years because the stream is taking care of a lot of that sediment on its own. Okay, this is Kenya. And I thought that you guys might be interested in this because Kenya is really focused on water towers. So they have a lot of really high mountains, and almost all of their water that everybody down below uses comes from these mountains, which I thought might sound familiar to you. This right here is a moorland, and it's at the top of Aberdare National Park. It's at 13,000 feet elevation. And these grasses are amazing. They're like tuppets, waist high, and there's little seeps through them. And this is the source of 4 major rivers. So of course, water towers, the mountains, the role that they play in kind of capturing the water and causing the rain to fall. The plants, their roots, plants play a role in evapotranspiration and creating that rain as well, but also their roots help the water move underground into the groundwater table and ultimately supplying the rivers. And this area is the primary source of water for Nairobi, which is Kenya's capital and home to about 6 million people. So one thing that was really interesting to me about Kenya is they redid their whole constitution about 15 years ago, because initially when they gained independence, they sort of just recreated the British colonial system, and then they decided, we need to do it more our way. And so water was actually a significant part of this retooling of the Constitution. And one thing that came out of it was something called the Kenya Water Towers Agency for Water Security. And so this is a national agency that is tasked with caring for and ensuring the integrity of several, 5 main water towers, but I think there's like 14 in total. And because recognizing that they are so critical in supplying water to all Kenyans. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble here with my notes, so some of this I'm going from memory. Oops, that was a little different to do. Anyway, there's been a fair bit of deforestation as well, from population growth pressures, also corruption. And this has been going on for a long time. Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for all of the tree planting efforts she did, she recognized that deforestation caused streams to dry up. And in fact, this is like the role that vegetation plays in the rain cycle is something that Western scientists are still studying and trying to understand. The basics are understood, but there's a lot that is evolving right now that's really interesting. But it's just conventional wisdom, it's folk wisdom in Kenya because people live close to the land. So, there's a lot of smallholder farmers, 1 to 4 acres, and they've seen we cut these trees and then our stream dries up. They've seen it in 1 or 2 generations. And so just below the national park, there's a national forest area, which is sort of like our national forests. They're like working lands. And many of those have been deforested, and now they're being reforested with native plants. So that's part of the restoration that's happening there. And then part of it is happening on these smallholder farms that are just below that, going down the mountain. There's like 300,000 smallholder farms in this area. And Kenya has seen really rapid population growth, like most of the African continent. That's where the population boom is happening this century, going from about 1 billion people on the continent around 2000 to probably 4 to 5 billion, 2100. So, every government person I talked to there was very concerned about this, from education, food, water, healthcare, provisioning. So yeah, the population has quadrupled since 1980. And a lot of people are moving into the highlands, cutting trees, and then planting. And as a result, this is very steep land. There's been crazy runoff, and so there have been flash floods. The water is super silty and takes a lot to clean, and then also really severe droughts. So they're seeing increasing flood and drought from climate change, but also from these land use patterns. So the Nature Conservancy founded Africa's first water fund in Nairobi, and it's for this Tana River, which starts in the Aberdares watershed that supplies Nairobi. And basically, they got together $20 million from different businesses, and then the interest is what funds these projects for the trees that are grown to be planted out, and also for working with all these farmers and teaching them techniques that can help to hold the water and the soil on the land. So this woman here, Josephine Mongwai, sorry, I'm not pronouncing that well. What she's doing here is basically digging a trench. So, it's very steep. She digs a trench across it. Then when the water flows down and it brings the silt, it makes a little bed over time in the, so she's got a series of steps going down the mountain. And so that holds the water. It also infiltrates a lot of the water. So she's having to irrigate a lot less, and her farm is much more prosperous than it was before. And what she's showing me on the right there with her machete, you can't really see it in the picture, but there's water coming up out of her spring there. And the spring had completely dried up until she did these practices on her land, and now her spring has returned. And in fact, in this watershed, they've documented at least 17 springs and streams that have returned since some of these restoration processes. And then another thing, like you can see how red the water is there, that's a sign of the extreme silt runoff. And that plant is called cocoa yam or arrowroot. It's very culturally important. And it loves water, and so they often would grow it right by the river, but then that causes more erosion. And so what she's showing me here is one of her cocoa yams that she grew in one of these trenches. Like, she doesn't have to grow it by the water now. She doesn't have to irrigate it. And one of the agricultural managers who was kind of taking me around, showing me these projects and introducing me to the farmers, we would stop at every single stream we passed because she was obsessed with water quality. And so, it could be like super muddy like this or just crystal clear, and it really depended on the number of projects upstream. They're studying like more broadly across the water basin. They've seen a 40% reduction in the sediment since 2013 in the key rivers that supply Nairobi. And they've also noticed an increase in water quantity, nearly 5 million more gallons of water per day flowing into the main reservoir compared to 2016 levels. So there are now water funds spreading all over the African continent and several others throughout Kenya and some of the other water towers as well. And they also have a really cool community management aspect, which has some issues with funding, etc. But the idea is that there is a community water management fund in every community, with the idea that people who are living right there on the land have a better sense of what's going on with their water and what's needed. There's also this concept of the water producers upstream and the water users downstream. I saw that in Peru as well, in the Andes, where that supplies the people downstream, and the farmers up there say, when we plant the water, we can harvest the water. So that's a whole other story, which I don't have time for, but it's in the book. So yeah, sooner or later, water does always win. And if we can let go of our impulse for control and instead collaborate with it, there's so much more space we can give it within our human habitats. And I'll just say, it's scalable too. Like, if you think of that Seattle example, it was such a small area, but every little bit helps, and it's cumulative. It's the way, solar panels on everyone's roof adds up to a lot of electricity. So, there's always space to start and then to add to it. And I mean, I can see that you're already doing that here in this valley in a really beautiful way. And I'll just say scientific monitoring of these projects is very important. I hear that from a lot of decision makers, gray infrastructure has a 150-year head start, right? There's so many studies showing we do this, we get that. And so, if we want people to be getting on board with this and funding this, we need that science. And often, that funding needs to be included in the project cost as well, or partnerships in the universities like Catherine Lynch did in Seattle. And then I'll just say, our dominant economic system is also to blame, right? We have all these externalities that aren't counted when we damage the ecosystems that support us. But I think that's true in the cost-benefit analysis also, that when we're looking at a project, right? Like if you need water and you want to build the dam, you're looking at that one thing. We build the dam, we get this much water. Or you're worried about flooding, you build the levee, is it going to protect, right? But we're not counting carbon storage, we're not counting habitat, we're not counting how a particular project can both prevent flooding and supply water during the dry season. Nor are we detracting from those mega projects all of the harm that's caused and all of the depleted ecosystem services that causes. So I think that's another important thing to bring into conversation is trying to do an honest analysis of the costs and benefits of these projects. This is my book's website where you can learn more. There's also various talks and interviews and excerpts and whatnot. And I'll just say, like, one thing that I find when I talk to people all over is that, climate change feels so overwhelming, and these water extremes are things that we haven't experienced before, and I think it can feel really overwhelming. But slow water projects are things that people can do in their own communities. It's very empowering, it's local, and it's scalable. And, they can buffer themselves, their own communities from these water extremes, and then there's also, of course, the climate mitigation component because of the carbon storage and wetlands and forests. So, yeah, it's an invitation to ask water what it wants.
Been, first of all, Erica is gracious enough to stay with us here tonight to do a little bit of Q&A. We don't often get to do this as a community together around water. So we'd like to open the floor to do that. And we haven't maintained enough of a space that we may try. No mics here at the outset, but Maggie and I may run some mics to each of you. So we encourage you to make yourself at home here. Feel free to grab a refreshment, fill up food, and we'll start into our Q&A. Any questions here in the room already that we can begin with?
Talk about the user situation. I think okay, well, the beaver situation. Beavers along the Yampa River, they don't build dams along the river. They're river beavers. So they basically are cutting down the cottonwoods everybody else in the. And for 30 years I've been wrapping cottonwoods and alders to keep the beaver from killing them. But I called CPW the other day to see if anyone needed a beaver or two. Because where we should have the beavers is up on the damn ski hill here. But do you think the ski company would have beavers up there?
Well, I mean, with the beavers have beavers up there. I mean, beavers are like humans, right? They like lowlands. And not that they won't live in headlands. They do, but my understanding is that they generally like the lower places first, and then, they're territorial, so if those are taken, then they'll move on up. So I understand your feeling about that, but I think, beavers also caucus, they create new growth, they create space for new growth, and so I think, you can wrap your favorite trees, but you can also plant other trees. That's what some people do, plant more beaver material. So I think it's all a process, and maybe try not to control the beavers either to the extent possible. I mean,
It'd be nice to see the beavers up higher in this country where they used to be.
yeah, well, I mean, I think if the population grows, then they will naturally go up there because the lower places will be occupied. Only a certain number of beavers will live in an area before they feel like they need to go find a new area.
Do bank beavers have as much control in water flow as land beavers?
They do not.
So maybe that's,
But I mean, any beaver would be a bank beaver if there was a good bank to live in. I mean, like us, they don't want to do more work if they don't have to. Yeah.
Erica, thanks for all those great examples. And I'm going to ask a rather mundane question, but as practitioners of some of these types of projects, we're beginning to think about monitoring in a way that makes the case for why they're so important. So I'm curious, when you think, I'm an ecologist, so I would approach it from a different approach than a water manager might. So what have you seen as some of the examples of the things that you can document that speak mostly to the water managers more than the ecologists?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's really about the water supply and then cleaning as well. So, if you can show that a wetland is absorbing X amount of flood flow, compared with a levee. So that's one thing I've seen that can be convincing to people. There's also the economic calculation. There was a study about, if you develop this wetland near a town or a city, it's very interesting, like in the wake of Sackett versus EPA, right? Which is like a property rights case. They have the right to develop on their property, which happens to be a wetland. But it's also a taking from other people, right? Because you're decreasing space for water, and so you're increasing flood risk for other people. So there was a researcher at Resources for the Future who did an economic analysis of that, showing, and it was really, really fast return on investment, like less than 5 years in most cases, in terms of avoided costs for flood damage by protecting the wetland rather than building on it. And then I think, there's a lot of water quality benefits too, depending on which water managers you're talking to. Yeah.
In relation to the water quality, you were talking about it in Seattle when they did that project,
Yeah.
how the pollutants went down because of the sediment, I guess, filtering. I mean, at some point, doesn't that get clogged up, that ecosystem now it's absorbed all those pollutants, and I mean, have they studied that, or what do you do?
No. I mean, they're in the process of continuing to study it, but the idea is like when you have a healthy hyperexism, you have lots and lots of critters who are in there breaking stuff down. So initially it's sticking to the biofilms, but then over time it's being broken down, and it seems like I said, they're studying how much and how quickly and scope, but it seems like they have a very large capacity for breaking things down, even like anecdotally, oil.
Yeah. Anyway, I can talk about it. I used to teach.
A little further down the river, and a little further into the summer, it won't be the Yampa wondered if you have any thoughts or experiences with flood irrigation, which is so important economically to grow hay in this valley. Maybe not Steamboat, it's got a lot of rich tourists, but certainly down the river, to Hayden, Craig, Maybell. If you've got land you can flood irrigate, you can feed cattle through the winter. You can sell hay. This valley's even sold hay to Japan.
So California used to do a lot of flood irrigation, and it's interesting because the Central Valley of California is a giant floodplain, and historically much of it flooded every year, and parts of it would stay flooded for 6 months. And so a ton of natural groundwater recharge was happening during that time. And then with flood irrigation, that was sort of, in a way, mimicking that flooding and that groundwater recharge. Now the problem with that is that depending on what you're farming, you may be using a lot of pesticides or fertilizer, which may then be contaminating the groundwater. And once it's contaminated underground, it's very difficult to clean, difficult and expensive. So I think, in California, a lot of crops have moved to drip irrigation, and there's an equal problem with pumping too much groundwater, but then also that kind of mimic of recharge isn't happening. I'm not sure that it should be because of the pollutant concern. In terms of hay, I'm more familiar with California, which really, in my opinion, should not be growing alfalfa because it's so water intensive. But I did see a really interesting example. I spent part of my time on Vancouver Island, and I went out to one of the smaller islands where a guy who used to be the executive director of the David Suzuki Foundation has retired to become a farmer, a hay farmer. And they don't have any real surface water on his little island, and so everybody uses groundwater, and they're concerned about water supply. And most of the wetlands have been drained and destroyed. And so there was one on his land, and he has restored it. He put in a tiny little weir, and now it's all back up and flooded. It has incredible bird life. And he told me that this field right adjacent to it was his worst field. And now it's his best. And he's not irrigating it at all. It's supplied with groundwater from the wetland. Obviously that's kind of a small scale, so I'm not sure how replicable it could be, but I thought it was a very interesting example.
All right, thank you. So it seems that there's been a lot of research done on beaver dams and beaver dam analogs, their attributes like base flow. Do you know if the same kind of monitoring and research has been done on rock structures? So we build wood rock dams and sea dike structures in California Park here, and it's something I've been interested about how you can monitor for those kind of structures, bringing more base flows to nearby streams.
Yeah, definitely, and I would suggest that you look at Laura Norman's body of work. If you just Google Laura Norman USGS, she has really quite a large body of work, and she's looked at so many different aspects of it, including base flow being constant throughout the year in some cases. One tricky thing about those wood rock dams is like you do have to go and repair them. You don't have the beavers doing the work for you. I think they can be very effective, and I think with all of these projects, I think the science is relatively new. I mean, maybe some of it going back 10, 15, 20 years in all of these different projects that I've talked about. But I talk to more and more scientists, and it's really a fast-growing body of work. So I'm thinking about Laura Norman right now because the story is in edit, but I'm sure there's others that I'm just not thinking of at the moment. But it's definitely out there.
This has really been terrific. When you've seen communities get interested in slow water approaches, in your experience, does it tend to be motivated more often by flood risk or by drought risk? That's my, actually 2 questions. That's my question number 1. And second question, it seems like microplastics are starting to get attention in the freshwater space. There's been a lot more attention in the ocean area, and I'm curious if you've intersected with that through this work.
I mean, I've really made it a point to look at places that had both flood and drought risk. So, I'm not sure one dominates. I do feel like, I mean, maybe just because I live in the West, it feels like scarcity is a bigger deal. But I think it really depends on where you are in the world. In terms of microplastics in freshwater, that is not something that I've looked at. I have done some stories on plastics in the ocean. So, yeah, it's a very sad thought, and thank you for bringing it up.
In terms of changing the dominant culture, the dominant thinking, what do you think will be the most, or is the most powerful influence in really reimagining and changing how we do everything day to day?
Yeah. Disaster is definitely helpful to kind of make people realize that business as usual isn't working. And I think, I strongly believe in nature's right to exist and plants and animals' right to exist. But I do think that being able to quantify things in economic terms can help get people on board. I think, our culture so much though does have a tendency toward that single focus mindset. So, climate change, people are starting to deal with climate change, and like almost everything you hear is about getting off of fossil fuels, which of course is incredibly important. But 25% of emissions come from land use change, and you don't hear hardly anything about that. And then if you do hear about it, it's like, oh, we should plant trees because they store carbon. But like people aren't really asking which trees or where, or maybe like don't plant trees on grasslands because that's an ecosystem unto itself, or people aren't looking at like how trees impact water, the water cycle, both pro and con. So I think, unfortunately, our culture does that. Even if they start to embrace something that seems positive, there's still plenty of room for it to go off the rails. But I do feel like the scale of disasters is faster now than when I started covering this stuff, and that is generating more of these regenerative types of conversations. And I wrote the book, I did a ton of research, but then in doing these speaking events, I keep learning more and more about all kinds of really cool work that's going on all over. So I don't think that really answers your question, but
Thank you. It's wonderful thought.
I'm both pessimistic and perhaps slightly optimistic.
Question. It does that. I want to ask a question. I love the science that you've gotten into with your slow water, but I always wonder if when science bumps up against politics and legislation, who wins, or when does it change? And the specific one I speak of is the fact that the flood insurance program has, I don't have any research on this, but I was going to say tripled in the last 50 years. And it primarily, I think, is because we still allow people to build back in the places they were flooded, so that it's set up for it to happen again and again. So I'm going to ask you to do a look into the crystal ball. What's the future hold? When and how will it change? Because it won't be slow water if we continue that path.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many of our systems that have misaligned incentives for common sense and even the good of people, and you know, it can be very hard to change those things. I think you know, toward the end of my book, I talk about managed retreat, both from coastlines and from along freshwater systems, and you know, flood risk is increasing more and more, and it's because of climate change. It's because of our development that has, you know, prevented space for water. And I think, you know, there are millions of people in the United States alone who are going to have to move, and you see it often with, you know, somebody gets flooded, and then they rebuild, and then they get flooded again, maybe the next year. In my highly unscientific analysis, it seems like after 2 or 3 times within like 10 years, then they've had it. But you know, there's a lot of really interesting work, like from A.R. Siders out of the University of Delaware, which is looking at kind of the social aspect of like, how do we move back collectively. Nicholas Pinter, who's a hydrologist, he's done some interesting work on small towns in the Midwest who actually have moved back together over, you know, after subsequent myriad floods. And I think too, you know, the United States, some places don't have money, but the United States has money, and the University of Concerned Scientists looked at places that were going to be flooded by 2050, and they calculated that it would cost slightly over $1 trillion to buy out all of those homeowners and businesses from those places that were going to flood, which is a lot of money, but you know, like, we forked out $1 trillion during the pandemic, so clearly, like, we could do that if we wanted to. I think you asked about the political, and that's a whole other ball of wax. But I mean, I feel like as a journalist, you know, I just need to tell people that these options exist and to show how well they're working in some places. And you know, I think business as usual when it comes to water has worked to a point, because we haven't had as many people as we have today, right? We've got, when I was born, there were 3.5 billion people on Earth, and now there's 8 billion. So, you know, that's part of why the land area covered by cities has doubled since 1992. There's just so many more people. And so things that maybe worked for 100 years, you know, they're failing more often. And so I have to hope that maybe reality will. But you know, it would be nice if we could do that before people suffer rather than after. But it doesn't seem like we're super capable. Yeah.
Hi, and thank you so much. This was really fantastic. I really appreciated your profiling of Kenya because I lived there and visited the aviaries and just loved Brian and all of the work that she's done. So it was very interesting. I have kind of a couple of questions that are sort of embedded in like a little bit of narrative. But my area of work is in the development sector, the international development sector, and within the sector we have kind of like a specific area of water, hygiene and sanitation, and it's not my area, so this has been a good learning for me. But I'm kind of curious because I'm working with an organization in Somalia who is reformulating their next 4 to 5 year strategic plan completely around water, because they found that it's really like the central solution or the central issue in terms of building ecological, social, community resilience. And I was wondering, like, to what extent are these solutions that you've mentioned and like this slow water movement, kind of like commonplace that folks in the WASH sector and development might be aware of, and to what extent are these like specific solutions that are just popping up here and there and you're covering them and we're getting this like little slice off the top, but they're not really pervading the like broader conversation around water in the world. And kind of with that, if you have any specific solutions that you've seen that have worked in Somalia or in similar like areas, that would be really great too. Sorry, that's a really niche question for everyone else here, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many slow water projects around the world, and I chose some and I excluded others, and I've learned about so many more since I've written the book. So I definitely feel like it's a growing thing around the world, and it goes by different names like green infrastructure or natural infrastructure, or low impact design, etc. So I think it's a broad movement and growing, but not getting the attention or funding that it needs to really step it up. In terms of WASH, it does seem like WASH is kind of a separate world, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I mean, for my own book, I had to make a decision not to cover pollution much, because I was really, water is such a huge topic in itself, and I decided to look globally. So, I decided to focus on too much and too little, and not very much on pollution, which, I think of WASH as largely having to do with sanitation and sewage. And so it's possible that, I have done some reporting on that in the past, but not in the last few years because I've been focused on the book. So that's all to say that I don't know if they are really separate or if I'm just not aware of overlap. Do we have a movie to watch?
We do. I am reluctant to cut us off here in our Q&A. Erica, thank you. It's been such a pleasure to spend the evening with you. We're so appreciative. She's offered to sign some books. So please come down and visit with her before you leave. But don't leave. We have a 26-minute film. It's exhilarating and a great way to end the evening tonight. And we'll cue that up here in a couple of moments. Take a break. There's plenty of food if you've got the hunger. And there's really good cold beverages here still. So help yourself.